Good morning. We will begin this hearing. To a large extent, we're going to be having votes in a couple hours, so we'll want to make sure we move quickly through this. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that our good friend and ranking member of the committee, Frank Pallone, is not with us today because his father died. We keep his family in our prayers. And although I did not personally know Frank Pallone Sr., I know he raised a good son. And so we thank him for that. And we'll continue on from there. Next, joined today also with my colleague who's wearing Denver Broncos orange. And congratulations for a Super Bowl. They must be a good team because they beat the Steelers. Now, on with our hearing. Good morning. We're reminded on a nearly daily basis that those who are seeking to do us harm through a variety of means, including biological attacks. The threats of attack and disease outbreaks are growing and ever-changing, and we're ill-prepared to detect and respond to these threats as rapidly as needed. Put simply, we have been caught flat-footed too many times in the past. We face a deadly enemy we cannot see. Our methods to find it are woefully inadequate, and we may not even know it's there until it's too late, and this is frightening. The federal government's ambivalence towards biological threats must end. Today, the biological threats confronting the U.S. generally fall into three distinct categories. 1, naturally occurring, 2, accidental incidents, and 3, intentional acts, which are often associated with acts of terrorism. We must be ready to guard against and respond to each of these threats appropriately. Now, it's easier for nation states and terrorists to obtain the resources necessary to produce biological weapons than ever before. And given the ease with which one can obtain and transport these resources, it is difficult for the intelligence community to collect, analyze, and produce intelligence about biological threats. The threat of a biological attack is not as remote as one would hope. Now, at the same time, pandemic and other highly pathogenic diseases are occurring with greater frequency and spreading more quickly throughout the world. As human populations put increasing pressure on remote areas and with ease of global travel, we will see more and more infectious diseases emerge. Since 2002, the world has seen outbreaks of SARS, chikungunya, cholera, influenza, measles, Ebola, MERS, and now Zika. The U.S. response to Ebola was a humbling reminder of the adage that everyone has a plan until they are punched in the face. We were not prepared for Ebola, and actions were described with great confidence one day and determined to be ineffective the next. This is what shakes the public's confidence, and instead of ensuring that the U.S. had strong central leadership, the administration's answer was to appoint an Ebola czar who served for 3 months. Sadly, the ad hoc approach continues. A Zika outbreak now threatens the continental U.S. What the world initially thought was a mild illness could in fact have far greater consequences if the virus also brings increases in microcephaly, Guillain-Barré syndrome, eye disorders, and potential for later developmental problems in children. While the administration has submitted a $1.8 billion emergency request to combat Zika, its latest budget request continues to leave funding gaps of more than $1.8 billion in Project BioShields, Special Reserve Fund, and pandemic flu countermeasures. Over the last 3 years, this subcommittee has examined the impacts of and our preparedness for natural and accidental biological incidents. We've held hearings on our flawed response to the Ebola crisis, the need for better preparedness for pandemic and seasonal influenzas, the unsafe practices by the Department of Defense, the Centers for Disease Control on the handling of live anthrax, and the Department of Homeland Security's broken BioWatch system. In the coming weeks, we will examine the federal response to the Zika virus. Each of these topics has a common denominator. The federal government was not adequately prepared. For years, we have lunged from crisis to crisis, reacting to what just occurred instead of planning for the next outbreak or attack. The subcommittee's oversight work has made a difference in each area, but I am very concerned that the federal government lacks an overall plan for biodefense. Instead of being reactionary, we must be proactive with a new approach. Last fall, the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense published its National Blueprint for Biodefense. The panel examined the current state of biodefense in the United States, examining issues related to prevention, deterrence, preparedness, detection, and response, to name a few. This is not a book that should sit dusty on a shelf, but one that people should read. And I am pleased that two distinguished commission members, Secretary Donna Shalala and former chairman of this subcommittee, Congressman Jim Greenwood, are here today to speak about the important work of this panel. We thank you. The panel's findings that we are, quote, dangerously vulnerable, unquote, to a biological event because we lack leadership and an overall strategy are frightening. The panel made 33 recommendations, many which fall within the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee and impact work that this subcommittee has done and will continue to do. The need for improved leadership echoes throughout the panel's report and is unfortunately a theme we have heard far too often about the federal government. Without leadership, there is no coordination of biodefense research, preparedness, and other issues, and without leadership, there is no strategy. The panel also makes a number of specific recommendations. We must improve our biosurveillance and biodetection capabilities. We need to detect pathogens in the air in hours and eventually minutes, not days. Agencies already collecting surveillance data should share it, not squirrel it away. We need a platform that allows for rapid diagnostic testing and vaccine development that can be applied not only to the diseases and pathogens we currently know about, but also to the ones we have not yet discovered. The Energy and Commerce Committee and this subcommittee in particular must take the lead in understanding and improving our biodefense capabilities. I thank our witnesses for being with us today. We look forward to hearing your testimony, and I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to welcome our witnesses, in particular former Congressman Greenwood, who sat right there in the chair you're sitting in for many years and who sat next to me while we had a lot of the hearings on these issues that you mentioned in your opening statement today. And I know he's just as frustrated as you and I are about the fact that we still continue to lurch from crisis to crisis in this country without any kind of unified or comprehensive response to some of these issues. When I was listening to your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, I thought to myself, who says bipartisanship is dead? Because my opening statement mirrors your opening statement to the point of talking about some of those very same examples that you discussed. So I won't read the whole opening statement because I do not subscribe to the adage that everything's been said, but it hasn't been said by everybody. So I'll put it into the record. I just want to highlight a couple of the issues. We've got the Zika virus going on, as you mentioned, right now, and we're scrambling once again after the fact to deploy the appropriate resources to protect our citizens as this spreads. Last year, it was the Ebola outbreak. We did finally organize to respond that, and we're still trying to put the systems in place to make sure that Ebola doesn't spring up again. This national blueprint for biodefense made a number of important findings on how to respond to these natural occurring threats, but also how to respond to deliberate attack. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the panel made 36 recommendations to better posture our government to respond to these emerging bio threats. Now, for those of us who were here during the fall of 2001, we remember vividly those little few envelopes of anthrax that arrived on Capitol Hill and the chaos that it caused within Congress. Offices were closed, buildings were fumigated, some congressional business was suspended, thousands of staffers and members of Congress lined up to get tested for exposure, and even worse, of course, some of the workers in the postal centers died. Now, this was a relatively small attack, so imagine what would happen if we had a large attack in a major metropolitan area or someplace else. That's why we have to be organized to deal with these things, and that's what brings us back to the findings of this panel. There are a number of really important recommendations, and I recommend to every member of this panel and every member of the audience that you read the actual blueprint, because it is sobering. But I think that the top observation that's made in this blueprint is that the nation is underprepared for a bioattack because we still lack centralized biodefense leadership. The panel recommends appointment of a single national leader under which preparedness for and response to biological threats could be consolidated. The panel recommends this authority be institutionalized in the office of the Vice President of the United States. And what the panel says is that this will, quote, ensure that biodefense will be addressed by every administration at the highest levels with adequate access to the president. I think this is a very unique recommendation and one that we should explore. And I just want to say one more thing, Mr. Chairman. one of the grand traditions of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee is to shine light on issues like this and to actually move the dialogue forward. So I was really gratified to hear you saying in your opening statement that you don't just intend to have this hearing today and let this go. I think if we really have a series of hearings diving deeply into the recommendations of the committee and take their recommendation that we have some of these hearings, we actually can make a long-term difference in how this nation is prepared. And that may be the very best legacy that not only this Blue Ribbon Committee, but also this subcommittee of Energy and Commerce can leave. With that, I'll put my full statement in the record, but I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to put Ranking Member Pallone's full statement in the record due to his inability to be here with his father's death. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Yes, and well, I'll also ask unanimous consent that any other members' written opening statements be introduced in the record. And without objections, they will be entered. And I believe, Mr. Chairman, you don't have an opening statement. And again, given the rush, we want to make sure we hear everything and every member gets a chance to ask questions before votes. We'll just move forward. So I will introduce the witnesses on the panel for today's hearing. The first witness on today's panel is the Honorable Donna Shalala. Welcome here. It's an honor to have you here. Former Secretary of Health and Human Services, and here today as a member of the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense. Over the course of her career, Secretary Shalala has demonstrated a strong commitment to public service from the Peace Corps to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. She is the recipient of the Medal of Freedom and currently serves as President and CEO of the Clinton Foundation. We appreciate your time here today. And next, my friend and colleague from Pennsylvania, the Honorable Jim Greenwood, former Congressman from the 8th District of Pennsylvania, Chairman of the subcommittee from 2001 to 2004. Mr. Greenwood is also a member of the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense and served since 2005 as President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. In this capacity, he has worked with BIO's 1,200 member organization to aid in the development of biotech solutions to major challenges in agriculture and healthcare. And we also look forward to your insights. Next, Dr. Tara O'Toole, who serves as a Senior Fellow and Executive Vice President at InQtel, a nonprofit strategic investment firm that works to facilitate connection and cooperation between venture-backed technology startups with the U.S. intelligence community. Dr. O'Toole formerly served as Undersecretary of Science and Technology at the Department of Homeland Security and Assistant Secretary for Environmental Health and Safety at the Department of Energy. And looking forward to hearing your expertise today during the hearing, and thank you also for being here. And now I'll yield to Mr. Flores, who will introduce our next witness from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, thank you for holding this hearing today and for the courtesy of allowing me to introduce one of my classmates and a fellow Texas Aggie and a renowned expert on public health. Dr. Jerry Parker serves as the Vice President for Public Health Preparedness and Response at the Texas A&M Health Science Center. At Texas A&M, he oversees the largest federal public-private partnership with the Health and Human Services Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, commonly referred to as BARDA, for vaccine development and manufacture. Prior to his current role at A&M, Dr. Parker had a distinguished career in public and military service, including serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Chemical and Biological Defense, and in that position, he was responsible for the military's readiness on many of the issues that are before us today. Dr. Parker also served as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS, and in a similar role at the Department of Homeland Security. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me the time to introduce Dr. Parker. His senior leadership positions at the Texas A&M Health Science Center, the Department of Defense, HHS, and DHS are critical to the topic before this committee. And thank you, Dr. Parker, for being with us today. I yield back.
Joan yields back, and if there's no more statements, we will comments will proceed here. To you all aware that this committee is holding an investigative hearing, and when doing so has had the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of our witnesses have any objections to giving testimony under oath? Seeing no objections, Chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel during testimony today? And all the witnesses say no. In that case, if you would all please rise and raise your right hand, I'll swear you in. You swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. And all the witnesses said, I do. You are now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. We will now entertain each of you with a 5-minute summary of your opening statement. We will begin with Ms. Shalala. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Just turn the microphone on and pull it close to you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Duguette, and members of the subcommittee. I've submitted a lengthy testimony for the record. Thank you for inviting us here to present our views and recommendations of the bipartisan Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense. I'm pleased to be joining former Representative Jim Greenwood. We're here on behalf of our co-chairs, former Senator Joe Lieberman and Governor Tom Ridge, and the other members of our panel, former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle and former Homeland Security Advisor Ken Weinstein. It's also good to see Dr. Jerry Parker, who is one of our ex officios, as well as Dr. Tara O'Toole, who constantly advises all of us on this important subject. We are deeply concerned about the biological threat, whether intentionally induced, naturally occurring, or accidentally released. And I want to emphasize those three issues because this is not a report just on intentionally induced biological threat. It also covers the naturally occurring ones or the accidentally released. I want to take a moment to address the threat now, but let me recommend that you get a classified briefing at your earliest opportunity. Make no mistake, we've been told that our enemies are seriously considering the use of biological weapons. During the invasion of Afghanistan, the United States uncovered evidence that Al-Qaeda was trying to develop biological weapons. More recently, ISIL has gained control of enough land, physical infrastructure, scientific expertise, and professional military personnel to potentially create and deploy biological weapons, and they have expressed their intent to use them. Additionally, the verification protocols associated with the Biological Weapons and Toxin Convention are weak and do not do what the world needs them to do, differentiate between legitimate and malicious activities. We're equally concerned about the threat of naturally occurring diseases with catastrophic pandemic potential. It's often very difficult for our scientists to guess the correct combination of viruses that will even make up the strain of influenza that will circulate the following year. Nevertheless, diseases do not have to kill millions to produce impact. There are a number of diseases that have affected my own state of Florida and New York and Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, America Samoa over the last 2 years. Now Zika virus is on the move as well, in some cases resulting in microencephalitis in newborns who contact it from their mother. The first case of local transmission has occurred in the United States, in Dallas, which of course was the first city with an Ebola case. This transmission did not occur from mosquitoes. It was sexually transmitted. Imagine the devastating societal consequences if we cannot stop the spread of this disease. Accidental releases also contribute to biological risk. I'm sure that you're aware of the recent laboratory biosecurity and biosafety mishaps at a number of our high-level laboratories. The organisms in which these laboratories work are too serious, too infectious, and too deadly for us to react indignantly, only to forget after a few months and move on to the next challenge. Our change must be institutionalized and sustained, and that is our fundamental message today. Our attention span tends to increase and decrease cyclically as different events occur and their impacts fade over time. Since I was Secretary of Health and Human Services, I have seen 3 administrations increase and decrease their emphasis on biological threats, usually in response to and after recovering from incidents such as the anthrax events of 2001, SARS, H1N1, MERS, and Ebola. And now we're all gearing up again for the Zika virus. We need a leader at the highest level of government to take responsibility and develop a comprehensive strategy and a unified budget and lead the whole of the government, along with non-governmental partners, to improve our national biodefense, and to do so attentively and consistently. We recommend that that person be the Vice President of the United States. one of the few who can get the government agencies and the non-governmental partners to work together. We are not necessarily talking about new programs or funding. Instead, we believe we can build on existing programs and infrastructure. And let me give you a few examples. We ought to be able to take an environmental biodetection system that was originally designed for the battlefield, for example, evaluate it, and if it seems useful, then modify it to fulfill our needs domestically. We should see how we could build on our pre-existing pervasive and familiar system of community pharmacies to get pharmaceuticals to localities in the midst of a biological incident, and maybe create smaller caches in advance. We cannot depend solely on a federally driven public point of dispensing model. Or take our hospitals, which meet accreditation criteria associated with funding provided by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We can use that to address various specialties, like trauma, for example. Doing the same for biodefense would cultivate better hospital preparedness for major infectious disease events. In doing so, we could create a stratified hospital system in advance of a biological event, knowing exactly which facilities are best positioned to handle cases. The funding that we could get through CMS is far greater than what is currently available through the Hospital Preparedness Program. While we support this grant program, is simply never going to be resourced enough to meet the need.
Could you just give a wrap-up, because you're over a couple minutes. I just want to make sure we have time for everybody.
I'm closing.
Okay.
Okay. In closing, I just want to note that Congress plays a critical role in providing necessary oversight and legislation. We need all of you to consider these recommendations and hopefully to move forward. And now, after you've heard from Jim Greenwood, we'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greenwood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm tempted to ask unanimous consent to insert your opening statement and the opening statement of Ranking Member DeGette as a preface to our report, because it's gratifying to see how aligned you already are with our recommendations. So thank you for inviting me to discuss preparedness for biological threats on behalf of the bipartisan Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Defense. As the former chair of this subcommittee, I am especially honored to be testifying here today. This hearing is quite timely, not because a catastrophic biological event has recently occurred, but because one has not occurred on U.S. soil. Whether it's the reintroduction of smallpox by a terrorist, a dirty bomb in an urban center, or another pandemic influenza outbreak, as the panel notes in our report, we are underprepared to respond to these threats, and we must take immediate steps to be better prepared. It's been a great privilege to serve on the study panel with my esteemed colleagues. Our report starts from the premise that the biological threat is real and it is growing. While we are better prepared today than we were a decade ago due to federal and private sector investments, the fact is we are still dramatically underprepared. Our report outlines 33 recommendations, and as Secretary Shalala stated, we as a panel all strongly support the first recommendation, calling for a centralization of leadership over biodefense in the office of the Vice President. I would like to further focus on the recommendations related to strengthening the public-private partnership, as industry plays a key role in protecting our nation. Consider a company with a novel technology applicable to the biothreats of emerging diseases identified by HHS. This company wants to partner with the government, but there are so many unique market challenges. Unlike products with a viable commercial market, the market for most medical countermeasures, or MCMs, is defined and supported solely by the federal government, making it a major source of research funding and the primary purchaser of vaccines, therapies, and diagnostics against these unique threats. Many companies begin research at their own risk, conducting R&D even before receiving federal government funds. Over the last few years, government funding for MCM R&D has been decreasing, just as the number of threats have been increasing. The investor community views these products as risky and a distraction from similar products that have a clear commercial value, making it difficult to raise the necessary R&D funds for MCMs in the private capital markets. The regulatory pathway is not always clear. Lastly, industry has seen a precipitous drop in the level of funds for the purchase of the final MCMs. For many companies, the biggest risk is that they will invest significant internal funds and time developing a product only to find there is no clear procurement strategy from the U.S. government due to sudden shifts in priorities or dearth of funds. Given all this, we strongly support the need for a comprehensive, multi-year strategic plan and unified budget that clearly outlines the priorities for R&D and procurement of medical countermeasures and pandemic influenza products. Such a strategic document would provide much-needed transparency on governmental priorities and projected requirements, thus helping companies determine what products to pursue in this partnership. The MCM enterprise must be fully funded. The Project BioShield Special Reserve Fund, the SRF, was created to provide companies with a guaranteed market for MCMs by establishing a 10-year advanced appropriation of $5.6 billion. The SRF has indeed proved successful in attracting companies to invest in MCM R&D. 12 MCMs were procured during the 10-year period, and there are over 200 MCMs in the pipeline. But the progress made due to Congress's initial $5.6 billion investment is now in jeopardy. The SRF was reauthorized at $2.8 billion for FY 2014 through 2018, but rather than a set-aside sum of money, the program has been funded through annual appropriations and much lower than the authorized amount. Unless funding increases, we are risking a $600 million to a $1 billion shortfall. Such a sustained deficit endangers the progress we have made and puts the 200 product candidates in the pipeline at risk. Similarly, pandemic influenza has been woefully underfunded the last few years. Pandemic influenza is a known threat that is very challenging given its versatile and persistent nature. It is imperative that our pandemic preparedness include advanced development of vaccines, antivirals, and diagnostics, rapid response capability building, and the replenishment of vaccine and antiviral stockpiles. Our plan calls for Congress to provide a legislative authorization to define and guide pandemic influenza programs in order to ensure that they receive the funding needed. Novel incentives could demonstrate the government's commitment to MCM development. One of the most important incentives in the report is the Priority Review Voucher, the PRV program, for pathogens designed as material threats. The PRV is a proven and valuable incentive that has helped to spur investment in other complex and neglected areas of R&D, such as neglected tropical diseases. An extension of the PRV program to include material threats is viewed by many as a way to offset the dramatic decline in procurement funding for MCMs. Adding MCM targets to the PRV program may help convince investors that the government is committed to this endeavor and provide increased certainty that MCMs have value. Improvement must be made in the contracting process as well. In addition to robust, sustained funding, the public-private partnership must be strengthened through improvements to the contracting process within BARDA to make it more efficient and predictable. Streamlining is key to ensuring that there are not excessive delays in the implementation of vital research. I therefore call on Congress to swiftly pass H.R. 3299, the Strengthening Public Health Emergency Response Act of 2015. This bill focuses on many of the issues I've raised today and represents a strong initial step toward implementing the recommendations of the panel. This subcommittee plays an integral role through your oversight of federal biodefense programs. I commend the committee's recent attention to pandemic influenza preparedness and the letters to the committee sent to the administration about flu vaccine supply and development and strategic plans. I hope that the Energy and Commerce Committee and this subcommittee continue to examine the issues of biopreparedness further. The threats facing our nation are real and many. Having products to support our national preparedness relies on the work of a few dozen biopharmaceutical companies. The only way these companies can continue vital R&D and capacity building is if the U.S. government demonstrates a strong commitment to them by providing clear priorities, sustained funding, and real incentives. If we invest well now in the broader set of known threats, we will be better prepared to pivot and respond when faced with an unknown threat. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on the work of the Blue Ribbon Study Commission. I commend the subcommittee for examining the state of our national preparedness for biological threats, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Greenwood. And now, Dr. O'Toole, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How's that? Is that better? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Jill DeGette. No? Technology, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am very happy to be here today to discuss this topic, which has been a preoccupation of mine for most of my professional career. I want to thank you for your kind introduction and emphasize the views I express on my own, not those of InQtel. I want to start by congratulating the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on their excellent report, which I hope will be highly influential. I especially endorse and share the panel's sense of urgency about repairing the country's vulnerability to highly consequential bio-events. Today, I want to briefly address 3 issues. First, I want to emphasize the nature and the significance of biological weapons threats and explain why it is a first-tier national security problem. Secondly, I want to describe why naturally occurring epidemics almost certainly will increase in frequency and impact in the coming years. Natural epidemics, it is important to understand, are different from deliberate bioattacks. The latter would be faster, fiercer, and it may be that many victims are beyond rescue. But if we cannot handle natural outbreaks more effectively and efficiently, we have no defense against biological weapons. Thirdly, there is a major revolution in our understanding of how the biological world works and our ability to manipulate it. The advances in bioscience and biotechnologies should be part of the foundation of U.S. biodefense against both natural and deliberate epidemics. These advances are going to be extremely beneficial to humankind across many different fields that go beyond biomedicine. But it also means that we now have created a world in which there is wide access to advanced biological knowledge and the materials needed to build and disseminate biological weapons. As the Defense Science Board said, in 2001, an age ago in terms of scientific advances, there are no technical barriers to non-state actors, including terrorist groups and lone wolves, carrying out devastating bioattacks that could kill millions and cost billions. But these advances in science and in biotechnology also, for the first time, give us powerful tools that could allow us to prevent and to rapidly detect and quench epidemics, whatever their cause. And I'm going to give you some examples of critical technologies which might help realize the panel's assertion that innovation is a key ingredient and that dramatic improvements in biodefense are within reach. First of all, the potential destructive power of biological weapons is akin to that of nuclear weapons. In 1993, the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment estimated that a kilogram of aerosolized anthrax dropped on Washington, D.C. in ideal weather conditions would result in 1 to 3 million deaths. That's about the same toll as a 1 megaton hydrogen bomb. These statements are not based on speculation, but on decades of development and field testing by the U.S. military during the offensive biological weapons program of the United States, which was ended by President Nixon in 1969. We also know that the USSR had a massive secret offensive BW program created after they signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972. These were both ambitious, and at least in the case of the U.S., highly successful programs. During the Cold War, the U.S. field tested many different bioweapons in realistic conditions, including releases from air, boats, ships, and subways. Declassified U.S. documents from the 60s clearly recognized the strategic power of bioweapons. We do not now know the fate of the Soviet effort. In the half-century since the U.S. ended its offensive BW program, there has been a revolution in bioscience. Advances in many fields including pharmacology and aerosol biology, and our ability to read, write, and edit DNA, the code of life, have resulted in tremendous beneficial achievements. But these advances have also meant the global spread of bio-knowledge and access to sophisticated biotechnologies. The materials and know-how needed to build a bioweapon have many legitimate uses. These are dual-use technologies, and as the chairman said, this makes the task of collecting intelligence about covert bioweapons programs exceedingly difficult. We are going to see an increase in the tempo of naturally occurring epidemics, which we can talk about in the discussion. I want to end by saying that there are two critical technologies that have not gotten sufficient attention in our biodefense program. The first is rapid diagnostics, upon which we've spent very little money and for which there is a very big market problem that makes it difficult for private companies to pursue diagnostics. And the second is vaccines. I see them out of time, Mr. Chairman, so I will await your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we recognize Dr. Parker for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Murphy and Ranking Member.
If you pull your mic real close to you, that would help. Thank you.
And thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. It is an honor to be here with Secretary Shalala and Congressman Greenwood, who are representing the Blue Ribbon Panel, and Undersecretary O'Toole, who is one of our nation's highest regarded biodefense leaders. I will put an exclamation point on the bioterror threat. For my part, I have been involved in biodefense since 1982 to the present. From the Cold War to the rise of violent extremism and the rapidly growing risk of naturally occurring transboundary emerging infectious diseases, I have been at the eye of the storm, witnessing the evolving biological threat over my career. Today, I am more concerned than ever about the risk of biological threats, including biological warfare, bioterrorism, and emerging infectious diseases. Biological threats are serious, whether naturally occurring, from an attack, or accidental release. The American public is starting to realize the threat of emerging infectious diseases following Ebola and now presumably Zika. Although the threat of biological warfare, and particularly biological terrorism, is very real too, it is less well understood. If there's any good news here, the number of countries thought to be conducting some type of illicit biological weapons activity, it has gone down from the end of the Cold War from about 12 to 5. But those countries include China, Iran, Russia, Syria, and North Korea. And their operational scenarios for use are no longer limited to military targets. Today, the risk from a bioterror attack from non-state actors, violent extremist groups, or individuals on civilian populations is a reality. Biological weapons are sometimes called the poor man's atom bomb, a term first used during the Cold War because biological weapons, as we have heard, have the potential to cause mass casualties on the scale of a nuclear weapon. But even a simple bioterror attack, as we heard earlier today, can have a devastating consequences, such as occurred from the anthrax letter attacks in 2001, that took 5 lives, sickened 17 more, and over 32,000 people took antibiotics because of potential exposure. And it could have been much worse from that simple attack. Some question the seriousness of the risk today because further bioattacks have not followed. And fortunately, additional attacks have not occurred, which I partially attribute to successful counterterrorism strategies. Why further attacks have not occurred, given the relative ease of mounting such an attack, coupled with our vulnerability, is up for debate. I do not want to overstate and particularly underestimate the threat and risk of a biological attack, and I also cannot predict the future. But we cannot ignore that extremists intend to do us harm by any means, and they are not morally constrained in the methods they use. The intent to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction by the likes of Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and others is known. Intelligence gathering is extremely difficult to detect a biological capability, an imminent threat, but we should not take the lack of intelligence as a lack of threat. The discovery of an ISIL computer containing plans to develop plague as a bioweapon should give us pause. Just this week, the Director of National Intelligence confirmed reports that the Islamic State used a chemical warfare agent in Iraq and Syria. The Islamic State is growing rapidly, has resources, controls necessary infrastructure and safe havens, and is recruiting scientists that could be capable of developing chemical and biological weapons. It may also be only a matter of time before a biologist becomes a self-inspired Biden extremist. We must assume the threat is real and serious. In addition to bioterror attacks, naturally occurring emerging infectious diseases continue to happen with greater frequency. Pandemic potential influenza viruses, SARS, MERS-CoV, West Nile virus, chikungunya, dengue, Ebola, and now Zika are real experiences that tell us we may be on the verge of a global pandemic anytime. Our biological threat preparedness response enterprise must also be ready anytime. Biological threats are not new, but we seem to pay attention only when an outbreak occurs or an attack occurs, and ignore it between outbreaks. The time between outbreaks, or the inter-epidemic period, though, is precisely when urgent actions are needed to optimize resources to hone our preparedness and response systems. Before closing, I would also like to add that initiatives in global health security and One Health are critical too, and they enable work in the prevention side. I would like to thank the members of the subcommittee again for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
I thank you, Dr. Parker, and all the panelists. It's pretty sobering testimony we hear, so let me start off and recognize myself for 5 minutes. First, Dr. O'Toole, you referred to this as a first-tier national security problem, and that bioattacks are faster and fiercer. So it seems like these natural outbreaks, they really are test runs for prevention, like how we handled Ebola, how we handled SARS, how we will handle the Zika virus. Gives us an opportunity to work on prevention, detection, and responding. But I don't think we are at all where we need to be. So given that, is there reason to be more concerned or less concerned about the threats of bioterrorism?
Mr. Chairman, I think you're right. I think our response to naturally occurring epidemics should be seen as test runs. Everyone here has lived through a lot of natural epidemics at this point, and we have gotten better. Again, I think for the first time we can actually contemplate the strategy of creating a foundation such that we could rapidly design and build, for example, a vaccine suitable for a particular threat in a much shorter of time than there's now the case. And I think we do have to prepare for a whole array of threats which we're not going to be able to predict. The other issue that Dr. Shalala mentioned is that a lot of our response depends on the state and local public health departments. They have lost almost 50,000 people since 2008. And so one could argue that our capacity to respond to an epidemic today has diminished compared to then. And that's a problem.
Thank you. Secretary Shalala and Congressman Greenwood, would it be fair to say that your bipartisan panel's general concern is that biological threats are increasing, while important aspects of the U.S. biodefense preparedness are actually declining or inadequate? Is that a proper conclusion? Ms. Shalala?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and echo Dr. O'Toole. Our infrastructure for dealing with these has gotten weaker, starting with the state and local response. One of the things that we forgot in the Ebola discussion is the states are our first line of defense. We've been putting resources and building the public health infrastructure for years with essentially block grants from the CDC. Those have been weakened, and if you don't have a state and local response, think about the outbreak of diseases caused by food poisoning, for example. It's that infrastructure that is the first line of defense for these biological issues that we're talking about. If we don't have a strong state role with their laboratories, with their tracking systems, then it's very difficult for us to pick up something that's going to recur, that we know that's going to recur over a long period of time. That's why we talk about the vice president, because it's very difficult for anyone else to pull in all the actors, the private sector actors as well as the public sector agencies.
Well, given these things, Chairman Greenwood, so as we have increasing number of these naturally occurring and accidentally occurring bio attacks, is our diminished capacity just because we're strained or because we have actually lost ground in dealing with these issues overall?
Well, I think to your original question, is the threat growing while the capacity to
Yes.
defend against it is decreasing? The answer to that question is absolutely yes. So if you think about the bioterror threat, and you think about ISIS, and you look at what they've been able to do with rifles and assault weapons and so forth, it's clear and it's obvious that their intention is to kill as many infidels and apostates as they possibly can. And you can do a heck of a lot better job at that using chemical and biological weapons than you can with conventional armaments. They want to do that, and there is evidence that's been cited, I think, already, that they are trying to figure out how to use bubonic plague. They are trying to, they tried to have a plan to poison the Turkish water system. So the intention is clear. While that's happening, the same technology, synthetic biology, gene editing, that is enabling our companies to do amazing things in terms of developing new drugs and new products, is also making it easier to formulate these new weapons. And so the threat is growing. And to see that in the face of all of that, the federal government's commitment to funding BARDA, to funding our abilities to develop these countermeasures is diminishing, is frightening. I'm glad you're having this hearing now, because the hearing you don't want to have is the one that happens after tens of thousands of people have lost their lives, and you're sitting here asking yourselves and government officials why we weren't ready.
Thank you, and that could happen any time. I see my time's up. I'll now recognize Ms. DeGette for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greenwood, you're exactly right, and this is what keeps me up at night, is the responsibility that this subcommittee has to actually move the ball forward, not just to have these hearings every so often. And the chairman will tell you, I every year, like in about July, I start nagging to have a hearing on pandemic flu before we're actually in the middle of the flu season. But I think what the Blue Ribbon panel is saying is we need to go even further than that. We need to have a system in place that's not based on response after the fact. Would that be your assessment too?
Absolutely. And if I may, let me describe to you what that system is. The only thing that stands between these pandemic viruses and intentional bioterror attacks, the only thing that stands between those things and the safety of our people is, frankly, a handful of private companies in this country who are willing to take the risk of developing countermeasures. And as has been said, this is unique. You don't sell those countermeasures at Walmart.
Right.
The only potential procurer of those is the federal government. And those companies, like every little biotech company, rely on investors. And those investors can put their money into a conventional biotech company, they can put it into an IT company, they can put it anywhere they want. They're looking for return on investment.
Right.
And if they see a system that's uncertain due to lack of a certainty that these products will be procured, they're going to put their money elsewhere.
And we've really seen this in the pandemic influenza program, and trying to prepare for that, and with these cuts. So I'm wondering, maybe Secretary Shalala, you can talk about how the funding cuts have hampered our response to the potential pandemic flu outbreaks.
Yeah. And I wouldn't underestimate, in addition to the private sector, those very fragile biotech companies, the importance of the National Institutes of Health and the fundamental science that we're doing, because if you don't have that, you wouldn't have the companies. So it's a combination of things.
Yeah, the problem is you need to get the basic research.
You do,
and then you also need to have the robust pandemic flu program so that you can support development of the vaccine by the private companies. So it really is a partnership.
And vaccines have not been a major priority of the multinational pharmaceutical companies. They don't make enough money from them.
Right.
There are marginals, particularly when the government is the only purchaser.
Right.
As was pointed out here, they don't have a lot of confidence that we're going to give them the kind of margins they can get from other kinds of investments. So this is a real challenge. Let me make one other point. Health as a national defense issue is relatively new. 20 years ago, no one was thinking about a national security issue related to some aspect of health. So think of this as the cutting edge of a dramatic new conceptualization of our defense. We're actually talking about the defense of a nation and about the health aspect
Right.
of that.
Let me ask you, why is it that the panel recommends centralized leadership in the vice president's office to coordinate all of this?
Well, since I sat in the major agency responsible for many of these issues, and since we now have a Homeland Security Agency, the fact is that the responsibilities for different aspects of this are spread across the government. And even the lead agency concept will not solve that. Or, in my judgment, a czar sitting in the White House. The czars work best when there's an emergency.
Right.
But if you really want to build up the infrastructure, you have to have a powerful person, and you can't have that in a cabinet agency, which is a peer of all the other cabinet agencies. So the vice president is the only person that can cut through that, talk to the private sector, and simultaneously talk to state and local governments, and put all those pieces together. He's also the only person that can demand a unified budget out of the OMB and across the government.
And this was a bipartisan recommendation.
It was a bipartisan recommendation. And I have to tell you, I hesitated. As someone who sat in a government agency, a powerful government agency, I hesitate to transfer power to a vice president or to the White House in general. As you know, cabinet agencies have a certain amount of tension with White Houses. But at the end of the day, this is one of the areas where you need a unified budget. The only other place we have a unified budget is actually in intelligence. So this is a parallel to that, to pull all the pieces together. And it's important enough to identify the vice president. And vice presidents always have some time to take on other responsibilities.
Thank
They
you
have a
very
lot of
much.
time, yeah.
Thanks.
Instead of running.
With all
Thank
due
you.
respect to our very nice vice president.
I'm sure he'll be pleased. You said he had lots of time in his hands. We now recognize Mr.
We have discussed this with the current vice president, but
Thank
it's not he particularly that we identified, but the office itself.
We'll bring him in here and ask him about that. Recognize Mr. Flores for 5 minutes.
Hard to follow that. Dr. Parker, you emphasized in your testimony that we should be urgently preparing for biological threats in the time between outbreaks. And in 2006, as you know, Congress created BARDA to do exactly this. But as you explained, we continue to seem to go in crisis mode only when we have an outbreak. So what else should the government do in these inter-epidemic periods?
Well, thank you, Congressman Flores. And actually, in answering your question, I'm going to come right back to the centralized leadership and how important that is. And I'll answer it actually with an example in my own experience and my own career. And that very same time in 2006, as the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act was passed, BARDA was created, we got very concerned about pandemic influenza to the point that an emergency supplemental was appropriated in that time, $6-7 billion. It was accompanied by a very strong White House-led pandemic influenza strategy, coupled to a pandemic influenza implementation plan. This is the closest example I think that has happened to date that kind of reflects the centralized leadership biodefense strategy that we actually did for pandemic influenza that accompanied an appropriation that really covered almost all the department agencies, state, local, private sector that were involved in pandemic preparedness back at that time. This implementation plan contained over 300 action items. It identified lead department agencies and supporting department agencies. It was very detailed. In fact, in my own department at the time, HHS, there was a lot of complaints that it was micromanaging and maybe superseding department authorities. Maybe it was. But we got stuff done. It allowed us to accomplish things that otherwise we would not have been able to do. And so that I just offer that as an example of something that we've already done. Oh, let me also add that we were very responsible for meeting our milestones and metrics that were part of this implementation plan, both in the executive branch and to Congress, because all congressional committees that had the appropriate oversight for their department agencies were regularly being updated. Hearings were happening on progress of that plan. So I just offer that up as an example of something in the past that I think is in the spirit of what the panel has recommended that would drive us a long way forward to doing what we need to do in that inter-epidemic period and before an attack occurs.
Well, thank you. I think that's helpful. Also, I want to compliment you on the great work that you're doing in the barter public-private partnership. Dr. O'Toole, the World Health Organization recently assessed that the potential impact of synthetic biology on smallpox preparedness and control. And the WHO scientific group found that the risk of reemergence of smallpox is increased due to the low cost and widespread availability of technology and know-how on how to create the smallpox virus. So the BRSP focused heavily on the threats that we face today. Can you tell me what's possible given the rapid advances in synthetic biology, and how have these advances in synthetic biology escalated the threat?
Virtually anything is possible today, theoretically. Smallpox is an ancient, huge virus. It would be very difficult to create synthetically a functional smallpox virus. There are many other choices available. We know, for example, that the Soviets created a vaccine-resistant plague strain. New gene editing techniques make that kind of creation of resistant viruses quite straightforward, although non-resistant pathogens can do a great deal of damage too. I'm not sure it makes sense to go to the trouble of making a synthetic bug. But what we are missing is the opportunities on the upside that synthetic biology and other advances allow.
Right.
Okay? I mean, we are in a revolutionary phase of biological science, and virtually none of this is being leveraged against our biodefense needs. We need a lot more than improved contracting procedures in BARDA. We need a commitment to revolutionize the way we make vaccines. Same thing with diagnostics. We can do this. We can shift the advantage to biodefense, but we can't do this with incremental, tweaks on the programs we have now, in my opinion. We need a much deeper investment in bioscience and biotech.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I've exhausted my time. I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. Dr. O'Toole, in your testimony, you speak of the need to take advantage of recent developments in bioscience to rapidly develop, test, and manufacture vaccines against emergent infectious diseases. Can you speak to the role that the Centers for Innovation and Advanced Development and Technology play in this process? And is this program indicative of the types of public-private partnerships we should be pursuing in this space?
I'm sorry.
Centers for Innovation in Advanced Development and Technology.
Yes, they can play a very critical role. For example, new diagnostics have a very difficult time getting approval to be paid for. So that discourages innovative biotech companies from making them. Imagine the difference it would make if we had a rapid diagnostic test right now for Zika, and we could very clearly say, you're infected, what is the outcome of your pregnancy? Or you're not infected. Same thing for Ebola. Imagine if we were able to tell within minutes if somebody was infected with Ebola, preferably before they're symptomatic. The technologies for a whole host of new diagnostics are out there. The path to making money on them is very, very troubled, both from a regulatory point of view. It's almost as hard as it is to get a new drug through, and the return on investment is not nearly as great, and also from the payment mechanism. So yes, the centers have a tremendous role to play.
Thank you. And Secretary Shalala, how does the first recommendation that you've shared with us today get off the ground? Should there be a congressional mandate to have the executive branch explore and implement if experts agree it's needed? What are the next steps to take us forward?
You know, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, whether Congress can designate the Vice President of the United States as a different branch. You certainly could make a recommendation in this area, and I think the fact that this committee would make a recommendation as part of a more integrated piece of authorizing legislation would have an effect. It is a new recommendation. If you look through all the other commission reports, this is the first time this has been elevated to this level. So I think both a combination of the visibility and some enthusiasm from Congress, from this committee in particular, would convince the next president of the United States to look at it very seriously. And of course, there are budget implications in that, particularly tying it to an integrated budget approach, which I think we all think is extremely important, and in which there have been very few examples at a very high level. Probably intelligence is the major one. The defense kinds of ones, you know, the defense agency itself usually leads. So it would take some identification by this committee, I think, that would make a difference.
Congressman, can I give 15 seconds
Sure.
on that?
Sure.
I think, I'm not a lawyer, let alone a constitutional lawyer, but I think that the Congress can provide the authorization to the Vice President, and then perhaps it's up to the President and the Vice President to decide to utilize that authorization, but I think that's probably the way it would work.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And Secretary Shalala, given the complications created by transferring technology from an innovator company to the Centers for Innovation and Advanced Development and Technology, do you believe it would be beneficial to establish a single location wherein the complete process from innovation to manufacture can take place quickly and nimbly in order to rapidly respond to the various emerging threats?
You know, periodically, the leaders of government, on both parties, have looked at that process and seen whether we can fast track it so that we can get products faster to market. There's so many jurisdictional issues. If a product has to go through the FDA process, for example, if it's exempted from the FDA process. So I think that that's an example where a vice president looking at the process and making recommendations about the integration, because it's a piece of the larger strategy, where that would make a difference. We certainly did that when we looked at, during my time, when we looked at fast-tracking AIDS drugs, for example. And we were able to take different elements and put them together in a way that protected safety, but also moved the needle very quickly in that area. But that's why, because there are so many agencies of jurisdiction, you need someone to think it through.
Thank you to each of you. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Ms. Brooks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our esteemed panel for being here today. I was a U.S. attorney in 2001 and was part of the response in the anthrax attacks, and actually had an office where that powder was sent to, multiple government offices were receiving powder, which, terrified that employee who opened the mail, not knowing if it was actually anthrax or if it was just powder. And I have to tell you, I thought, and I was in federal service until '07, and felt like we were moving forward. But I have to tell you, until this report came out, and until we've seen kind of the lack of adequate response to Ebola, quite frankly, I really do believe we have stepped back and that we have just moved from crisis to crisis. But I just encourage my colleagues, this is an outstanding report with 33 recommendations. It is a roadmap. It is a blueprint. And it is in part on the basis upon which Congresswoman Eshoo and I introduced 3299, the Strengthening Public Health Emergency Response Act of 2015. And I want to talk about that because I really appreciate all of these recommendations. I encourage my colleagues throughout Congress to read this book because you as experts talk to experts around the country as well. It's not just the people on the panel. A lot of work went into this, so I commend your work. Mr. Greenwood, can you please share with us the merit that you see in returning the contracting authority to BARDA, back to BARDA, which is in my bill, and can you talk about the importance of that and what has happened and why we're not able to get, vaccines and our medical countermeasures through the pipeline as fast as we need them?
Well, thank you. Originally, the contracting authority was with BARDA, and it was changed. It was moved to, I'm going to refer to my notes here, it was moved to the an office called the Acquisitions Management Contracts and Grants Office. And the problem is that the technical experts are not there. And they are, in fact, at BARDA. And, in fact, because of certain regulations, there's a firewall between the two, and sometimes they actually cannot speak to one another. So this is imagine how frustrating it is for a company trying to get a contract. And it's talking to folks who know a lot about contracts, but they don't know a lot about this issue, about medical countermeasures. And so I think it makes all the sense in the world to eliminate that level of bureaucracy, put the contracting back at BARDA where it belongs so that the experts in the field can talk to the experts in the company with whom they are attempting to create contracts.
Thank you. And with respect to the companies trying to get vaccines into our stockpiles, can you and Dr. Shalala please talk about the fact that we don't have a sufficient coordinating mechanism in our national strategic stockpile also identified? So we don't even have, if I'm not mistaken, the right coordination between CDC and BARDA to have the right vaccines in our stockpile. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yes, and we made recommendations in that regard because the system is weak now and needs to be strengthened. And thank you, Congresswoman, for your leadership on this issue as well.
Thank you. Mr. Greenwood, any comments with respect to the stockpile?
It goes to the central point, which is that we are not organized as a government to effectively and quickly respond to either pandemics or bioterror because the authorities are diffuse. They don't always talk to one another, and that is exactly why a central unified plan, a strategic plan, a central budget, and giving the authority to the Vice President makes all the sense.
And I think citizens believe and know we have these stockpiles and believe that they are adequately filled with the proper rights of the types of vaccines. Would anyone else like to comment on our national strategic stockpile? Dr. O'Toole.
I'm the chair of a National Academy Committee on the Strategic National Stockpile right now. And they have made tremendous progress in the last 20 years. The problem with the stockpile is that the new drugs that are going into it are largely biologicals, and they're very expensive, and they expire in 2 and 3 years. Mm-hmm. So there's a pipeline of new countermeasures coming in that increases inexorably the cost of the stockpile, and everybody's budget is staying flat. So the limitations on the countermeasures we have in the stockpile, first of all, are budgetary limitations. I mean, this is an expensive proposition. The stockpile already holds about $7 billion worth of stuff. But we're talking about having to cover multiple cities with these sometimes very expensive drugs and vaccines. We need a cheaper way to do it, which is why I say you're never going to be able to create a stockpile that has everything you want in it against every contingency. We have to move to a strategy of being able to quickly design and manufacture at scale what we need.
Thank you all for sounding the alarm. Appreciate your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Mullen for 5 minutes.
I still need it pushed. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. I first want to thank Ms. Shalala, I hope I say that right, and Mr. Greenwood for this report. I'll tell you, the more that I learn about it, the more I wish I wouldn't read it. I'm serious. It's very troubling when you understand the false security that we have, even from something as simple yet dangerous as the flu to the most serious threats that we're facing today. And in a previous hearing, I was talking about our CDC's national stockpile, strategic stockpile that we have, and in particular the weaknesses that we have there. And following Ms. Brooks here, I want to get a little bit more in depth about what you see as maybe our biggest weakness, maybe the biggest two weaknesses, some of the biggest threats we have with the stockpile, some recommendations. Don't get into it too deep, just maybe one or two that we can start working on in the committee here.
Well, I actually think Dr. O'Toole is the expert on the stockpile issue, and that she has outlined what the challenges are in the stockpile. It doesn't cover everything. It's expensive to maintain because they have a short shelf life. It was a good idea at the time, but constantly having to renew it is our biggest challenge. I think that most of us think that there are other issues we can address. We certainly, and certainly scientific issues that would give us a longer life in some of these areas. And I think on the production side, Tara, our ability to produce something faster and not being totally dependent on the stockpile is probably where your IOM commission is going.
You know, and yesterday I had a meeting with some biodefense individuals, and they were telling me that, you know, there is technology they're looking at that would extend the life of the shelf life through maybe a dry freeze. Is that correct? And then also they're retesting it too, and some of it that was designed to go 2 or 3 years lasts as long as 15 years. So they're constantly retesting it. But how do we dispense it? How do we get it out? Having it in a stockpile is okay, but it doesn't do us any good if it's housed one place and we can't get it to where it's needed.
One of our recommendations was to use the existing community pharmacies. The original idea was to use the VAs because they're spread across the country and they do keep a certain amount of supply.
We're having enough problem with the VA right
they're
now.
well located, the
Right.
VA hospital system and warehouse system. The government has also contracted with, I think, with FedEx, to move pallets around the country. And the reason for that is because the military is not well situated to do that kind of thing. So there has been extensive discussions in the government and a strategy for moving pallets of drugs very quickly using, I think the contract was with the FedEx system originally to move pallets around the country when there are outbreaks.
Ms. O'Toole?
The big problem with the stockpile is traversing what's called the last mile. It's not about delivering the stockpile to the state public health departments. It's about getting it into the hands of people. And as you can imagine, that dispensing function is very complex. Washington State is going through pharmacies. That won't work in every state, particularly rural states, although most Americans live within reach of a pharmacy. Advanced deployment is also being used in those very few states that can move very, very quickly to dispense, such as New York City. One thing that would definitely help is more money for state health departments and local health departments to do drills on dispensing. These are invaluable, but they're very
Agreed.
time-consuming and expensive, and they simply don't have the money to do them. New York City does them, some of the big municipalities do them, but making those a more viable way to practice would, I think, make an appreciable difference.
That's a great recommendation. Mr. Parker, Dr. Parker?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back. Everything you're asking actually really comes back to centralized leadership. We've been talking about lyophilization of vaccines for 15 years or more. The last mile of dispensing medical countermeasures from our SNS, that is the hardest challenge. In fact, there was an executive order in about 2009, 2010, and I was just discussing this with one of my colleagues from public health from Chicago yesterday. It seems that work has just disappeared. But with centralized leadership, focused work on how to solve that last mile of actually dispensing the medical countermeasures would go on. And we need that, because it's one thing to have a stockpile with Cipro and tetracycline, and it's one thing to be able to get it FedEx to get it to an urban center. But actually getting it into people's hands is a huge unsolved problem.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Now recognize Ms. Castor for 5 minutes.
I'm going to scoot over a little bit. How about that?
Well, good morning, and thank you to the panel for your terrific work on this important subject. And Ms. Shalala, the folks at the University of Miami we're so appreciative, and everyone across the country, for your service. I know they miss you there, but it's great to see that you continue on in your service. I wanted to focus on hospital preparedness. During the Ebola outbreak in Africa in 2014, we took a critical look at hospital preparedness and its important role in our nation's response to biological events. At that time, in response to that, the President requested emergency supplemental funding for Ebola. The Congress responded. Now with Zika, we're having to do that again. This doesn't seem to be the most efficient way to prepare for emergencies. I'd like to ask a few questions about this, about what we can do to assist hospitals throughout the country in their response. You know, we had some that were very well prepared, like Emory University. What a terrific job they did because of their association with the CDC. And NIH, of course, was at the forefront in that Ebola response, but some did not do quite as well. And there's no mystery that if that had been more serious, that a lot of hospitals across the country would have struggled. So what lessons do you think we learned from this, from the Ebola outbreak in Africa and the few cases that came to the U.S.? I'd like to ask maybe Ms. O'Toole first.
Hospital preparedness is very important. I think between 2002 and 2008, it did improve for two reasons. First of all, disaster response drills are required for accreditation by JACO, by the Hospital Accrediting Facility. Again, for hospitals, doing those kinds of drills is expensive and difficult. There also was a CDC HHS flow of money to hospitals to help them with bioterrorism and pandemic flu preparedness. And what happened with that money is the hospitals started forming coalitions. In my city, in 2001, Baltimore, the mayor for the first time got all the CEOs of the hospitals together in one room. This is a private sector competitive industry. They don't necessarily cooperate, let alone collaborate. And those CDC funds made a real difference. These regional coalitions of hospitals grew used to figuring out how they were going to share resources, share information, et cetera, et cetera. That funding has been cut in half since 2010. That makes a big difference.
Secretary Shalala, the panel's report mentions that that disease-specific preparedness funding is the most inefficient and costly manner in which to fund preparedness. What are the alternatives to disease-specific programs, especially since many states have frayed their public health infrastructure? How can we respond better and give the hospitals and our local communities the tools they need?
We have specific recommendations in this area, including a steady stream of funding. We recommend that it be done through the accreditation system and through CMS. In addition to that, we've recommended a tiered system. Every hospital in this country cannot be prepared for every complex disease. So both the regional coordination, but more importantly, identifying those hospitals that can have special rooms set aside. In Florida, for example, all of us looked at, particularly at the great public hospital in Miami, whether we could build separate rooms with separate access to handle Ebola patients. And in fact, went through an exercise to make that possible. A great public hospital that sees all sorts of diseases probably is the best place to do that, as well as academic hospitals around the country. So creating a tiered system in which we know where we would send patients once they're stabilized, obviously, that would have the capacity and the separation to be able to handle these diseases is certainly the way to go. We have some specific recommendations both on funding, on the accreditation process, but in particular on creating a tiered system in this country that would give us coverage across the country as there are outbreaks.
I think that's a very important recommendation, and I would encourage the committee to act on it as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
I recognize Mr. Kramer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panelists. And I want to focus on this incentive issue, Congressman, that you've raised. And I will admit right up front that what I'm about to do is very dangerous. I want to think out loud for a little bit, and then also admit that you're not going to adequately inform and educate me in 5 minutes. So you're going to have to come to my office and help me work through this idea, because you've all done a great job, as has the panel, the Blue Ribbon panel, in scaring me to death. So I'm adequately prepared to understand the threat, and I think that's very important. But in our political world, of course, when it comes to the appropriations process, part of why I think you don't see Congress acting or the government acting proactively is because we respond to the people we represent, and they will blame us when we're not prepared, and they'll blame us when we spent money foolishly. And of course, we're talking about finding a way to invest in something that we hope is never needed. And so that's our political dilemma. I would, if starting with you, Congressman Greenwood, and others, if you want to weigh in, maybe just elaborate a little more on the SRF, the PRV, how we could help pharmaceuticals, the private sector, feel comfortable with the investment and the innovation. And we've talked a fair bit about it, but if there's a way we could elaborate just a little bit more to help me better understand how we're going to do this. And I might also emphasize, is there a way to put a cost-benefit analysis on this? For example, Ms. Castor was talking about emergency responding. That's a cost. That's a cost that could be avoided, perhaps, if we are better prepared, right? So has there been some work done in that arena that helps me assure my constituents that we're not just appropriating, but that we're efficiently and effectively governing?
Well, thank you for admitting that we frightened you. And obviously, your constituents are not clamoring for this because it's a sleeper.
Yes.
No one is thinking that this is going to happen. And as I said earlier, the hearing you don't want to have is the one about why we were unprepared for the event that was so tragic. So I think to some extent, leadership involves informing your constituents, and this hearing is an important part of that this threat is real.
Yes.
I mean, I calculate when it comes to bioterror that they have the terrorists have the motive, they're trying to acquire the means, and despite our best efforts to deflect that, over time the likelihood of that happening is 1 over 1. Okay, it's going to happen, and we have to believe that. We have to believe that the threat is real. So in terms of what works to be prepared, we talked about the contracting reform, which is a minor thing but an important thing, and Congresswoman Brooks is leader on that. We've talked about the need for there to be sufficient funding to actually procure these MCMs when they're developed, and the Secretary was completely correct when she said not to underestimate basic research at the NIH, that's critical. But when it comes, just like in every other medical medicine that we develop, when it comes to actually developing the product and manufacturing the product, that's private sector is the only place where that is done. And to invest money in that, the companies are willing to take the risk that maybe they will fail at the science, but the investors are not willing to take the risk that if they succeed, the federal government's not going to be prepared to reward them by procuring the product. So that's critical, and you need enough money and money over time to be certain, so there's a certainty that when you get to the end of the road and you get your product approved, that Congress hasn't moved the money around and it's no longer there.
Secretary Shalala, I can see you may want to weigh in on this, but one of the things, I appreciate that your national defense analogy, because I was thinking a lot about, we spend billions of dollars on weapons we hope we never use, right? Now, they do have the benefit of being a deterrent, understandably, but it isn't dissimilar. We have to constantly make this case. So I thank you for that, and the centralized leadership as well. I'm still struggling with the whole vice president thing myself, but the more you talk about, the more sense it makes. So I appreciate that. Is there anything else anybody would add to what the congressman has said about the investment?
I would like to add a little bit, and perhaps maybe just pull on the contracting itself as well. As we've heard, many of the companies in this space that are really contributing to biodefense, and particularly those that are bringing the more innovative solutions, are struggling themselves. And the typical FAR-based government contracting is really contrary to the biotechnology industry in and of itself. And so I would think, I've actually been encouraged recently with some pronouncements by DOD to begin to start using some authorities they already have, like other transactions authorities. So I think just also taking a look at what are other things in just the basics of contracting that could make it more readily accessible that the innovative biotechnology companies would actually do business with us and the government is something to look at as well.
Thank you very much. And if we could solve DOD contracting in the context of this, that'd be a bonus. That'd be a cost-benefit analysis worth doing.
Thank you. Recognize now Mr. Green of Texas for 5 minutes.
If we could solve the DOD contracting, we could probably have them audited. I want to welcome our panel here. The Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense highlighted vulnerabilities in our ability to combat emerging and reemerging infectious diseases, particularly drug-resistant infections, which could cause catastrophic loss of life and have already started to make even minor infections fatal. Without greater investment in antibiotics, we face a future that resembles the days before these miracle drugs were developed, one in which people died of common infections. Many medical advancements we take for granted become impossible, including surgery, chemotherapy, and organ transplantation. The challenges presented by the rise of drug-resistant bacteria for which we have no effective treatments are representative of the challenge facing medical countermeasure product development. The market forces simply do not work and fail to foster the kind of pipeline we need. In 2012, this committee passed and Congress passed the GAIN Act, and again, in this current session, in the 21st Century Cures Act, we work to remove the financial and regulatory barriers to antibiotic drug development. Secretary Shalala, can you elaborate on the study's recommendation for incentivizing the development of medical countermeasures for emerging infectious diseases with pandemic potential? Specifically, please explain why there is such a need for a government to play a leadership role in this space.
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward that the only purchaser will be the government. There's not a private sector market for these particular biologicals, and therefore the government both has to incentivize the companies financially so that, and I think the other thing to understand, and Jim could explain this better than I can, these are relatively small companies, often with a small number of products. We've known a lot about the biotech industry. They're fragile. I like to use the word fragile when you talk about them, so that unless they know that they're going to be compensated and reimbursed for the cost of development, not just the cost of production, but the cost of development, unless there are financial incentives, I don't know how we're going to move very quickly in this area. We've had some experience. Congressman Waxman in the Orphan Drug Act.
Yeah.
We had a lot of diseases in which there were very small markets, at least initially, and the Congress, in its wisdom, passed legislation that encouraged companies to invest in creating drugs and treatments for a very small part of the population. Our problem here is we start small, but we may need a production line that's huge at the end of the day. I don't know any other way to do it except with financial incentives. I just don't know. I think everything that we've learned, it's not just that I'm a capitalist, it's just that from our point of view at a public policy issue, when the market is going to be the government, there is no other way to get a very small number of industry people to invest unless they know there's going to be a market at the end of the day.
Jim, and again, welcome back to your committee.
Thank you, Congress. So nice to see you. One of the proposals we have is the Priority Review Voucher, the PRV. And the beauty of it, I mean, if you look at, Congress in its wisdom looked at neglected tropical diseases, and we knew that there's no financial pull, that these diseases that occur in places like Africa, the countries are so poor that they really can't afford to buy the products, so investors just aren't putting their money there. When Congress created the Priority Review Voucher, it works beautifully, because what it does is it says to a company, if I can get a drug approved, even if I don't make enough return on my investment from the procurement of that product, another, maybe a large biopharmaceutical company, will pay me, and these things have gone, there are only 2 or 3 of them sold, but they gone for $200 million, $300 million, $400 million. It doesn't cost the taxpayers a penny. You know, Pfizer or Merck or Glaxo or somebody buys that, which just simply gives them a foreshortened review period for some other product. And that doesn't cost the taxpayers any money either. It just, they pay their PDUFA fee, they get their product approved, and sometimes they don't get their product approved. But if they do, it gets approved a little faster, it gets on the market, and by the way, then it goes off patent sooner anyway. So it still doesn't have any cost to society.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but we have legislation that's in the Senate, and that would fast track, because we recognize the government's going to be the one that has to do it, because the free enterprise can't invest that money for something, but there is legislation. Hopefully the Senate will deal with cures in the complete package that our full committee approved overwhelmingly.
Thank you, Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That would be nice. Recognize the Vice Chair of the full committee. I'm sorry, Ms. Blackburn.
Yeah, that woman from Tennessee. I tell you what, Dr. Parker, I am so happy to see an Aggie on the panel. I've got Aggies in my family, and they always bring good common sense, seasoned wisdom to the table. So happy to see you there. And of course, Mr. Greenwood, and how much we appreciate your insights on this and your dedication to the biotechnologies and the work that you've done there. Just a couple of things that I want to touch base on. In talking with some of my research centers, and in Tennessee we have such an aggressive biotechnology group. And when I was in the state Senate, I helped to formulate that group, and so they've got a good underpinning, and it doesn't matter if it's Vanderbilt or St. Jude's or whatever. They talk to me a good bit about the right balance between government and regulatory oversight, and then the ability to incent. And Mr. Greenwood, I'm so pleased that you just mentioned the priority review voucher for the MCMs. I just think this is, when you look at these medical countermeasures, that is just so important that we have that. And it doesn't matter if it is a material threat, if it is something like Zika. We have to have a way to go about this, but I want to come to something that Dr. O'Toole mentioned, and then Congressman Greenwood, if you will kind of answer to that. basically, her point was you move products to a point of scalability. And then if you need something, you're ready to move with it and can push that scalability quickly. So let's go back to that voucher, Mr. Greenwood, and if you'll continue that conversation and kind of build that out, the importance of that, how you would address these for something that is a material threat, or like the Zika virus, which right now there is not a vaccine, and people are saying, what are you going to do? Why didn't you know this was a problem? The Olympics are coming to Brazil. People have been vacationing for months in the zone that is affected, etc. So let's go back to the importance of having that priority review process for this type of occurrence.
So there's great uncertainty for a company to, we've seen our companies proudly jumping into the Zika issue and trying to do some research on it very quickly to develop products. But I remember a company a member company of Bio that was involved in trying to, it looked like it was close to having something on Ebola. And they almost didn't want to talk about it because their stock was fluctuating like this. All of a sudden, everybody would invest in that company, and then another company was doing something, and people would pull out, and it created unpredictability and volatility. And so it's an example of how the norms of economics don't work in this field always. So the priority review voucher takes away one of the uncertainties, and that uncertainty is that it doesn't take away the uncertainty of, can we make this product, and will it be safe, and will it be effective? That's always a risk, and I will tell you that doing that is harder than putting a man on the moon. You know, most companies fail, and most projects fail. So it's hugely risky to even bother trying. But if you do try, and you do succeed, the only reason your investors are giving you the leeway to go and do that is because they think that somehow they'll get a fair return on that investment. One way to do that is to have enough money in the reserve fund so that and have it there not just year by year, but have it there in multiple years, so the companies can know and their investors can know if we succeed here, they'll buy the product and we'll get our investment back. But the priority voucher review is an entirely different way to do that. And because they have become so valuable, it is a huge driver. It's a huge incentive, because if you can succeed, let's say right now we had a priority review voucher for Zika, right? Companies would know that if they could succeed, and if they, not only would they have the great satisfaction of being able to spare people from this disease, and God forbid more children born with microencephaly, but that they would have this voucher they could then take to the marketplace and sell it at a very nice return, and use that money to invest in the next countermeasure. So I think it's a no-brainer to me. I know that there's some political questions about it, but I don't think there should be, because it costs the taxpayers nothing, it costs society nothing, and it provides nothing but benefit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yield back.
Young lady yields back, and now recognize Dr. Burgess of Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our panelists for being here today. I apologize for missing part of the hearing. We're having our budget season. Mr. Greenwood, you'll remember what that is like. So never a dull moment around here today. Dr. O'Toole, I want to ask you, because we've had several hearings over the past several years. Just for context, my congressional career goes from SARS now to Zika, long enough for people back home to say term limits, but on the other hand, there may be some value in seeing some of this stuff over a continuum. But you reference in your testimony about what are called laboratory developed tests. And Zika, boy, it comes into focus because, okay, you got a polymerase chain reaction, but only a few places can do it. It's pretty valuable, pretty accurate, but it's hard to get. You got to go through a health department to get it. There's an IgM antibody, but it will cross-react with some other viruses, so you're not really sure if your result is accurate. But would you just speak to the regulatory hurdles that you describe in your testimony and laboratory developed tests? Because we in this committee have been studying that. There is a movement, as you may be aware, to move the regulation of laboratory developed tests from CLIA, the Clinical Lab Improvement Amendment, which is basically administered through Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, over into the Food and Drug Administration and require basically the licensing of laboratory developed tests just as if they were a new drug or device. And we know the problems with the timeline of those things. So could you just speak to that briefly?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congressman. First of all, the reason FDA is so concerned about diagnostics is that they can have life or death consequences. And we might want to think about different standards for diagnostics during public health emergencies.
Yes, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute. That is called clinical judgment, and you and I understand that because we trained as physicians, and that has to be part of the equation. It took me 3 years to get from Dr. Sharon at the FDA a list of the problems that he was worried about with the development of laboratory developed tests. Where are the outliers? Where are the problems? Now, to his credit, the last time he was in here a few months ago, he did produce a list of 20 tests that he said these may be problematic. But there are 11,000 laboratory developed tests out there, and they are useful every day of the week in a clinician's office. So I'm sorry, but continue.
So let me narrow the problem down to tests that we need for infectious disease, and particularly during epidemics, okay? And we need a variety of different kinds of tests. As you know, you want a very sensitive test when you have a low prevalence, but you don't want that same test when you're in the middle of an epidemic. So it gets tricky. However, here's the problem. It's very difficult to validate a new diagnostic against Ebola or even Zika if you don't have curated samples of those diseases. In my view, the government, you can put this in DOD, you can put it in HHS, you can put it in FDA, the government should develop a curated bank of diseases about which we are worried so that companies, especially these small, agile, fragile companies, could come and test their diagnostics against them so that they could much more rapidly give FDA useful data on how well their test works. That's one. Secondly, I think just as FDA has emergency use rules for medical countermeasures during public health emergencies, we ought to think about emergency use rules for diagnostics, which I think we can actually create rather rapidly and manufacture quickly during public health.
I will just tell you, last year or 18 months ago during the peak of the Ebola outbreak in September, I went to a hearing at the Foreign Affairs Committee where we heard that the FDA had actually put a clinical hold on, I think, a drug called TK Ebola that was at that time in use in treating patients with Ebola. I mean, I didn't want to hear about clinical holds. I wanted to hear about clinical trials. So it really did seem like they were an obstacle faced with this worldwide scourge. Dr. Shalala, I just need to ask you a quick question on your, and I so appreciate your listing out the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Task Force. In my political training, which granted was a street-level course, I was sort of taught that you only do 3 things. If you produce a list of 33 things, no one listens to you after the third one. But I did read through your list, and it is a good list. It's an exhaustive. I hope it's not static, because one of the things that we've worked on the 21st Century Cures Bill is the whole issue of interoperability of electronic health records. And if we do not address that fact in this, in the recommendations that you have, I think that's actually going to stymie the ability for researchers and clinicians to communicate rapidly, de-identify data to be sure, respect patient privacy rights, but at the same time, we need to have that ability for rapid learning within the system, whatever develops.
Well, as you know, there's been a lot of progress on electronic medical records in this country, and continues to be and you're absolutely right. It's the touchstone piece. I should say that even though we have 33 recommendations, we have actually staggered them to identify those that we think Congress should do immediately, that have more of a midterm value and a longer term strategy. So we very carefully laid out a strategy that would be workable for Congress.
Thank you, Chairman.
And the federal agencies at the same time. These are not just recommendations for Congress.
Very good. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Bilirakis for 5 minutes.
Thank you for allowing me to sit in on this very important hearing. As the former chairman of the Emergency Preparedness and Response Communications Subcommittee for Homeland Security, I recognize the need for the country to be proactive, not just reactive, to a host of biological threats, both natural and man-made. I'm glad that I can continue to be involved in the Energy and Commerce Committee, so I appreciate being given the opportunity to sit in on this subcommittee. Secretary Shalala, earlier you mentioned that the state and local agencies are the first in line of defense against outbreaks and attacks. You also said that much of their funding through block grant programs has been weakened. What should we do to enable state and local entities to be prepared to respond to outbreaks or attacks? Is there enough of a focus on medical surge capacity and mass prophylaxis capabilities? Do we need flexibility in our grant programs?
Could you turn your microphone on, please?
Yeah, the microphone.
Turn your microphone on, please.
We've lost 50,000 public health employees in our states and local governments as well, and that has to be properly funded. The tradition has been to have almost a block grant that goes from CDC to the states. I believe in that tradition. I believe in the relationship between the CDC and states and local governments to build an infrastructure, because the CDC is not a line agency. When we're in an emergency, we think they are, but it's really the states and the local governments and their public health departments that are responsible for both the tracking, the identification for all of us in this country. And we have to make sure that infrastructure, the states are under great fiscal pressure in this country, and we have to make sure that infrastructure is beefed up, that stays in place.
Thank you. Next question is for the panel. You all mentioned that the lack of comprehensive biodefense strategy and the need for centralized leadership. What, if any, protocol is in place now to enable coordination between the agencies such as DHS, CDC, HHS, and various state agencies when there is a disease outbreak? And what capability gaps exist in coordinating efforts between agencies? What makes coordination a challenge? We could start with the Secretary.
Well, I think earlier I talked about the fact that there were multiple agencies that are involved when we have an outbreak like this. And while HHS has very strong responsibilities and has the scientific and public health expertise, Homeland Security, the Defense Department, I mean, there are all sorts of agencies across the board, and we have made a very strong recommendation that the Vice President be the ongoing coordinator in this country, because the lead agency concept no longer works when you have various jurisdictions involved, and in particular when you need to work with the private sector, with state and local governments. Unlike FEMA, which basically can order people around, it's very difficult for one agency. And I say this reluctantly because as a former HHS secretary, I wanted to own the world. But when you don't have proper jurisdiction, when you don't have the leverage, then you have to elevate both the responsibility, and we're much more sophisticated about the role of the private sector, the development of diagnostics, and that this has to all be part of our overall strategy in this country.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, and the need to be able to elevate it, and that centralized leadership not only is needed at the federal level, and to try to close these gaps between each individual department and agency, because they want to exercise their own authorities, but there are gaps between them. But this will transcend all the way down to the state, local, private sector level, and it's only if you have centralized leadership coming from the White House, however that's done, is going to help kind of break that and transcend that leadership. And as an example, you mentioned Surge Medical at the local level. It's not just a public health thing. In fact, it's going to be more logistics. That's why emergency management and other disciplines are going to be so necessary to affect, in this, your example, Surge Medical dispensing of antibiotics. It's more logistics. Public health doesn't do logistics. So that's really why it's so important. This centralized leadership concept is just so critical. Everything comes back to it, and it transcends the federal, state, local, private sector levels to close these gaps that we have between the multiple disciplines and agencies that have to contribute to biodefense.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Griffith of Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. Dr. O'Toole, during the Ebola outbreak, there were weaknesses identified in our system that we are now witnessing again with Zika. Surveillance, detection, diagnostics. Overall, how would improved surveillance of animal disease outbreaks strengthen our surveillance of human disease outbreaks and make us better prepared for dealing with epidemics?
Well, the majority of emerging infectious diseases come from animals. They're diseases that affect both humans and animals. So we definitely need to do a better job looking at those hot spots where we are likely to see spillover from one species to humans. Most of those hot spots are in tropical zones, in the jungles of South America and Asia and Africa. Most of our surveillance is in temperate zones, for starters. And we're now beginning to have tools such as high-sequencing genomics, high-speed genomics, that could actually give us a much better handle of what diseases might be about to spill over. So we ought to think about funding field surveillance of these hotspot ecosystems, for starters. Secondly, we ought to fund much more rigorously the USDA's existing program for looking at agricultural animals, because modern methods of agriculture put sometimes tens of thousands of animals together, creating our own industrial hotspots for spillover, and we've seen that with flu and the loss of turkeys and chickens in the past years. Thirdly, for humans, we have to have a much more strategic approach to surveillance. We've spent billions, literally billions, on surveillance in the past 15 years. Some things have worked, some things haven't. We've done a terrible job at lessons learned. And we ought to go back and figure out what really has made a difference. Part of that is, again, we sound like broken records, funding state health departments, because that's where, the rubber meets the road. But we have to help state health departments do a better job. Diagnostics, again, critical, 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 critical. Clinical disease is very vague. If you don't have a diagnostic to say this is Zika and this is dengue, you're going to have a hard time figuring out what's going on at the beginning and at the middle of an epidemic. I would be very careful about investing large amounts of money in particular surveillance programs unless you know exactly what they're supposed to do, whether they work, and who's going to use that information.
Well, and my next question was going to be that, are we doing an adequate job of integrating human, animal, and environmental health? I think you already answered that by saying, no, we're not doing such a good job of integrating those. Secretary Shalala, how can we improve integrating those three components to develop a more comprehensive strategy to ensure that we're prepared for whatever's next?
I think our major recommendation is that we put this responsibility in the Office of the Vice President, that we really need a national leader with the clout to integrate all these pieces and to help us think through a strategy, because the integration itself will have to be done by agencies and by others, but the strategy, having the metrics for it, keeping people accountable, we've all recommended that we elevate that to the Office of the Vice President.
I appreciate that. Dr. O'Toole, lots of concerns being raised about Zika and our athletes competing this summer in the Olympics, not only our athletes, but all the spectators who will go down, the coaches, the family members, etc. Do you believe that that we will be ready? Obviously, the Brazilians are going to have to do some things, and this is an international effort, but do you believe that we're going to be ready to be able to defend our folks, or have the biodefense efforts ready to defend our athletes and spectators and coaches and family members who go to the Olympics this year?
Well, I understand the deep concern that Zika has raised. Whenever children are affected, you know, grown-ups get deeply, deeply worried, and that's what's happening here. I will say that there are dozens of very dangerous mosquito and even tick-borne diseases that have been with us for millennia. And you can, to some extent, protect yourself from mosquito bites by using DEET and dressing well and sleeping in places with screens and so forth. That's not a perfect protection. It's not a zero risk. We have to wait and see till we have more information about what is really going on. We've known there has been more or less an epidemic of dengue and chikungunya. And dengue is a serious disease. In South America for a few years, that hasn't stopped people from going down there. I think we have to wait till there's more scientific data about Zika. I know NIH is working on a vaccine. I wish we had one. But I think if I were a young woman who is pregnant or getting pregnant, I'd think twice about going to South America right now. But I think for most people, there are ways to at least mitigate the risk.
All right.
Chairman, would you indulge me with 30 seconds on the Zika question? Thank you. I just wanted to point out that aside from medical countermeasures on Zika, there's a whole field of looking at how to bioengineer mosquitoes, which we already know how to do, so that they're all males, they don't bite, and they mate with the females, and the progenies don't survive. And I think it's a fascinating new technology that may be part of the solution to this problem.
Thank you. I know we have votes in a few minutes, but Ms. Brooks, if you have one quick follow-up question.
One quick follow-up question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Greenwood with respect to the Priority Review Voucher Program. Can you share with us existing PRV programs for rare pediatric disease or neglected tropical diseases, increasing the biotech investments in this area? Can you give us some examples where you've seen that already happen?
I probably have that in my notes, and if I had time, I'd be whispered to behind. But I'll just say...
And if you would like to submit it for the record, that would be fine.
Well, we'll submit that for the record. But suffice it to say that it is working. It has created, both in the area of pediatrics and in the area of neglected tropical diseases, it has generated a tremendous amount of interest and investment, and it is working perfectly well, just as Congress intended, and I have no doubts that it would work well in this field as well.
And do you believe that if we added the DHS's material threats to the FDA's PRV program, it would spur additional development of the medical countermeasures?
I think that is precisely what needs to be done, and I have no doubt whatsoever that it will be successful in inspiring investment in this very dangerous field.
Thank you all. Yield back.
Dr. Burgess, do you need a quick follow-up question?
Yes, and Secretary Shalala, you've spoken about the Vice President as sort of the overseer of all of this, and I appreciate the fact that there are too many agencies and too many people involved, and when too many people are in charge, no one's in charge, and I get that.
And too many committees of jurisdiction.
And I don't quite share your enthusiasm for putting this into the executive branch. Perhaps it should be a speaker's position, but nevertheless, I will just tell you, I was down at the border, Lower Rio Grande border, last weekend, and you realize you've got the CDC map that shows Mexico and Central America being purple with Zika, and my state's the other side of a relatively narrow river. It just seems to me we don't pay enough attention to border control. I know you can't stop mosquitoes at the border, but really the issue is stopping people who are infected or potentially infected. And right now we are undergoing another surge of unaccompanied minors and family units. And to the best of my ability to detect, we're not looking. And that is a point of great concern to me. So all of the other things we've talked about are extremely important. But let us not forget border control, because that is that's an issue as well.
Well, I'll leave that to your comments, but I would say that we also have to beef up global health, and that is PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, which is part of the World Health Organization. We can't stop mosquitoes from coming across borders. Whether it's in people or they're just flying across. But it's not only beefing up our own infrastructure. One of the things that we learned with Ebola is that the World Health Organization doesn't have the kind of authorities it needs. It doesn't have the resources they need. And so it's not just a state and local issue or a federal issue, it's also an international issue. And I think your point about border security is also but I would put it in the context of international health security and looking at the agencies that we have now, the international agencies that we have now, and we know that they're weak. We learned that during Ebola and previously, and this committee also might have a hearing, because there have been recent reports on the international health organizations, to take a look at those relationships as well.
Thank you. I know you're going to call votes any moment. I just want to follow up with two quick questions. If you can't answer this here, get back to us. I'd like an answer from each of you. If you know of countries that have model programs to do the very thing you're describing, would love to know about that. Does anybody know any offhand, or would you like to get back to us on that?
My only comment, Mr. Chairman, is that if we don't have it, I would be very surprised if anyone else in the world
That's what I fear.
doing it.
To be fair, there are centralized health systems in smaller places that may be more integrated, but I think that we have different levels of government, different levels of responsibility. We need to we can't use their models. We'll have to put our own system together.
Another question, just hope you can give information to us for the record. Based upon, given the recent GEO report on the failings of BioWatch programs, including the lack of valid performance data, should we continue to fund it? Do you have an answer for that, or you want to get back to us?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question, Mr. Chairman?
Should the federal government continue to fund the BioWatch program, given the recent GAO report on its failings and problems, including the lack of valid performance data?
I think we probably will get back to you on the record with that.
O'Toole, Ms. O'Toole, can you answer that?
I'm a longtime critic of BioWatch, but I think you should continue to fund the current program for a defined period of time until we have a strategy for what we're going to go do next. I think the notion that BioWatch, or even the next-gen BioWatch, a series of environmental sensors, can protect the country is wrong-headed. The technology just isn't good enough. The cost-effectiveness ratio is just not advantageous. We need a new generation of technology. It's not there yet. Again, diagnostics would make a big difference. You do need these sorts of sensors to protect high-risk targets and national security events and so forth. The problem with BioWatch right now is it is not characterized, as GAO points out very graphically and I think accurately. We don't know that it works. It's not clear that it doesn't work. It has a very limited range of bugs that it looks for, and to really cover an area of a city, you need a lot of those machines.
Thank you.
So it'd be very expensive.
Well, with that, I want the committee, first of all, thank you. Oh, yes, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you. First of all, with all due respect to my friend from Texas, I don't think that any kind of border control, even building a wall, is going to stop these vector-borne diseases from coming over. And I know that's not what you mean, but what it does really highlight is how we are an international community. It's not just the mosquitoes coming. We even had Ebola cases come here because of international travel. And so that's why it's so unbelievably critical that we take this report seriously and that we really work hard as a committee. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to commend you again for calling this hearing. I know you're planning to have a classified briefing when we come back from the February recess, and I think that's a good other step. And then I would just finally offer my input and the input of the minority staff and members to help come up with a robust hearing schedule for the rest of the year. I think if there's nothing else we do, then spend our time on this report and the recommendations, trying to get our arms around it and get that sense of urgency to our respective leaderships, then it will have been successful.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody again from the commission for doing this deep dive, because it really is important.
And let me also announce on March 2nd, we will have a hearing on the Zika virus where many of these issues will come up. We'll take a deep dive in that as well as what my friend said about getting into a classified briefing and some of the biodefense issues. Critically important and should be a wake-up call for America. But as you've said a couple of times, Mr. Greenwood, we may not do these things until after the fact, and that would be a tragedy. So we'll get moving on that. So in conclusion, again, I want to thank all the witnesses and members that participated in today's hearing. I remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record. I ask all the witnesses agree to respond promptly to the questions. And with that, this committee hearing is adjourned.